This lesson is securing web APIs with JSON Web Tokens. The objectives for this lesson are to learn about security in ASP.NET. We'll add in the JSON Web Token JWT package. We're going to configure authentication. We're going to create a set of security classes. We're going to then generate JWT tokens within those security classes. And we'll finally secure endpoints using claims. Security in ASP.NET is not much different from any other web server or service that you're doing. We have an authentication piece, and that authentication means the user has to prove who they are via some sort of credentials. This is then going to allow that user access to the site. Then we have authorization. Now that's what a user can do once they are granted access to the site. And it can be either role-based, where the user is assigned to one or more roles. It could also be claims-based, like specific actions that the user is assigned to these different claims so that they can do different things. We then secure each endpoint based on the role or the claims. There are many methods that we can use to authenticate users. There's ASP.NET.Core Identity, which helps you manage users, passwords, profile data, roles, claims. There's external login providers such as Facebook, Google, Microsoft account, Twitter, all sorts of different external providers. There's JSON Web Tokens. There's OpenID Connect. There's Auth 2.0 Framework. So many different things that we can use here to handle the authentication piece. Let's go ahead and add authentication and add a require authorization method to an endpoint, and let's see what happens. Open up the program.cs and locate the configure cores. Just below that, you want to add and configure authentication and authorization. And then let's go down. So after we enable the cores middleware, let's also enable authentication and let's enable authorization. Then what we're going to do is we're going to come over here to our product router class, and right here on this one, let's add require authorization. So with those three things in place, let's now go ahead and run this, and let's see what happens when we try to get products. So we'll come down here, we'll try this out, we'll click execute, and look at that, we get an error. Now it's a 500 error, and if you look at the detailed message, it's going to tell you that there's no authentication scheme specified. What does that mean? Well, it means we've said that we want to use authentication, but we haven't said how we're going to do it. And that's what we need to add in next. To start out, let's talk about JSON Web Tokens. These are also called a bearer token. It's an open standard for securely transmitting information. It uses a JSON object that's been digitally signed using a secret key or a public-private key pair. So either way works. Now, a JWT consists of three parts: a header, a payload, and a signature. And you can even decode your token here at JWT.io, and I'll show you that. A JWT bearer token format, like I said, is a header, payload, and a signature. So the following is broken at the dots to show what it looks like. We generally would not be broken across multiple lines here, but I want to show you the header portion. Then we have the payload part, and then we have the signature. The reason we have to have all three of these is this is how it is digitally signed. Okay, so the header. The header is the signing algorithm that is used. It contains within there the type of token, like typically JWT, and then the algorithm itself, which in this case is a hashing algorithm 512. The payload is really all the claims that you're putting in, and there's some that are kind of part of JWT, and then there's ones that we can add on ourselves. So there's the subject, there's the identifier, there's a not before the time the token is valid, the expiration time, there's all sorts of these different things. Then you add in your own, which are the private claims like is authenticated, get a product, update product. And you can have as many as you want in here. To use JWT and ASP.NET, you're going to add two packages. system.identitymodel.tokens.jwt, and Microsoft.ASP.NET Authentication.jwt bearer. You're then going to have to set up some configuration items for JWT. We're going to need a secret key, an issuer, an audience, minutes to expiration. We can put all of this into our app settings file. We're then going to have some way to authenticate a user. So the user is going to pass in some credentials with a name and a password or something like that. And you're going to have to authenticate that somehow. I'm going to do a very quick and dirty hard-coded sample here in the course. Then you're going to have to generate and return a JWT bearer token for that authenticated user. It's going to be unique for each user, of course. And then it's up to the user to pass that token back each time they make a call to the endpoint. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to run that endpoint, or at least any endpoint with the require authorization on it. Let's take a look at adding JWT to our Web API project. Right mouse click on the AdventureWorks API project and select Manage NuGet Packages. Go to the Browse tab, type in system.identitymodel.tokens.jwt. Select that, select your version here, and let's install it. Go ahead and accept anything there. Then let's also bring in the Microsoft.ASP.NET Core Authentication JWT bearer package as well. Now this one you want to check and make sure that you're using the dependency for your version of .NET. This one is for .NET 7. I'm using .NET 6. So I believe if I go back, sorry, I missed it by one. There we go. The 6.014 is the one I'm going to use, but you choose the one for your version of .NET. And you want to check that anytime you're installing packages now because there's so many versions out there. So let's go ahead and accept this. We've now loaded up a couple of those packages. Let's now go open our appsettings.development.json and let's add a new property that is another JSON object within our AdventureWorks API. We're going to have a key, which is a secret key that only you know for this particular web server. We're going to have an issuer, which is the web server itself. So make sure you change that port number to be whatever it is for your web API project here. The audience can be anything you want, but I typically keep it about the same name as my server. And then minutes to expiration, I want these tokens to last 10 minutes. And after 10 minutes, it's up to you what you do. You could either make them log in again, you could renew their token. Kind of just depends on what you wish to do. Let's now go to the entity layer, right mouse click and add a class. And this class is going to be called JWT settings. And it's going to match the settings over in our app settings.development. So we have a public string key, issuer, audience, minutes to expiration. In the constructor, set them to some starting value, but we're going to read these in from our app settings location there. So let's go ahead and open up our AdventureWorks API defaults and let's add a property that is of the type JWT settings. And then let's go ahead and initialize this in the constructor. Now, since we've put this within the AdventureWorks API defaults, remember we're reading those in already just by .NET reading them from the configuration file. So let's run this and we'll go to our config test assigned to class. And if we execute this, we should see our values right there for the JWT settings now coming from the app settings.development.json file. We now need to register JWT Authentication with ASP.NET. Let's take a look at how we do that. Let's go over to our service extensions class, and we're going to add in another extension method that we're going to use to configure JWT authentication. So you see the configure JWT authentication method here. It's again going to be part of our extension class for the services, and we're going to pass in AdventureWorks API defaults settings. So we need to get the settings so that we can use those here. Now, it's not important that you understand every single line of code that's going on in this particular method, but let me give you the highlights. services.add authentication, and we set the options to say, I need a default authentication scheme, a challenge scheme, and a default scheme. And that's all going to be the JWT bearer defaults authentication scheme. Now that came in from the package that we brought in just earlier in the manage NuGet packages. And this is, remember, the error message that we got said it needed some sort of default scheme. Well, that's what we're solving that error message now. Add JWT bearer, we're setting up some options and we're creating a new token validation parameters object. And it's inside of here that we set up all the things that we created in our JSON file that we're now going to use. The valid issuer, the audience, the signing key, the clock skew of the minutes till expiration. So all of those, as you can see, are coming from settings.jwt settings.issuer.audience.key and .minutes to expiration. Let's now go down and add one more method here, and it's configure JWT authorization. Again, it's on that services collection. And all we're going to do at this point is return services.add authorization. We will add more to this a little bit later. Let's now go over to our program.cs, locate at the top here where we add and configure authentication and authorization. Let's replace those now with these two new calls, where we now do builder.services.configure JWT authentication, passing in the data we get from the JSON file that's now been packaged within our AdventureWorks API defaults class. And let's also call our configure JWT authorization. Now, with that all done, let's try running this just to make sure everything is still working, everything except the product call. That one is not going to be working yet. But you should try out a couple of these others, just make sure they still work. Great, still works. If we come down though here and we try to execute this one, we're still going to get an error. It'll be a different error because it's no longer an authentication scheme error. It doesn't know what to do because we're not actually set up. We haven't created all we need to do to really get JWT bearer tokens to work yet, but we're getting there. We need to create some more classes to get all of this to work. So we're going to create an app user class that will hold the username and password and, of course, any other user information you want. And this is going to determine if they have access to the site. We're going to create an app user claim class that we're going to use to hold claim information for a user and what they are allowed to do on the site. We're going to create an app security token class that holds the user and the claim objects, and it holds the JWT bearer token. So we have to create all these new classes. So let's go back to our project and create these security classes. So these security classes, let's put them into a new folder in our project here. We'll call it security layer. Right mouse click on that and add a class called app user. Pretty simple class here. We got 4 properties: user ID, username, password, and is authenticated. Anytime you have a password property, folks, make sure you mark it with that JSON ignore. You do not want that to accidentally be serialized and sent across the wire somewhere. As you can see here, we're just going ahead and initializing, some values in the constructor. But there's our app user class. The next class we're going to create, we're going to call it app user claim. And this will be just for handling claims. So we have 4 properties: a claim ID, a user ID, claim type, and the claim value. And we're going to see what all these do in just a bit, but let's just keep it set up for now. The last class we're going to create will be our security token class. So let's add this one. Call it app security token. And what we're going to put in here will be an instance of our user class, our app user class, the bearer token itself, and a list of those app user claim objects that we just created, and we'll call that claims. Again, initialize them all up here inside of the constructor. Now that we have all these nice little classes to hold on to user and claim information, we need a class to basically do the authentication, create the bearer tokens, get the claims, all of that. And that's what we're going to do now with this security manager class. We're going to create a method called Authenticate User that the caller of your web API project will pass to you a name and a password. Now, it could be whatever you want. I'm just going to use a username and password here. And this is going to be a public method that we use to check if a user is valid. We're then going to have a validate user method that's protected that performs the lookup in a data store. I'm going to just do it hard-coded here in this particular course. I've got another protected method that loads the user claims. So it's going to load all claims for the authenticated user. Again, you'd probably go out to a table for this. I'm going to simply hard-code it for this class. And then I've got another protected method called build JWT claims that takes the claims for the user that we get out of the table and adds them to our bearer token. And again, one more method called set JWT that creates the bearer token using user and claim information. Okay, this is going to be a big class, so let's go ahead and dive right into creating this security manager class. Once again, right mouse click on the security layer, add a class, call it security manager. And now this is a big one, folks. So as you can see, it's a little over 166 lines of code here. I'll try to break it so you can see everything here. But as you can see, there's a lot of code, and there's this whole set of methods here that all deal with authenticating the user, creating the claims, creating the bearer token. So our first method, authenticate user, you pass a string for name and string for password, as well as the JWT settings class. We're going to create an app security token, AS token, and we're going to call validate user, passing in the name and the password. When it comes back, we're going to check to see, did that user get authenticated? If they did get authenticated, we'll load the user claims and we'll set the JWT token. So let's take a look at the validate user method here. What I've done inside of here is I've passed in the string name and string password. I create an app security token in here. I then have got some hard-coded switch statements, a case for Paul S. and John K. So that's all it is, just Paul S. or John K. Those are the only users we're going to allow for this system. And the password is hard-coded to password. Then in this AS token, I set the user.username equal to the name they passed in. I set the user ID to a new GUID, and I set the isAuthenticated property to true. And then same thing for John K. I just create a couple of different GUIDs. Each one has a little bit different name and a different GUID. There we go. We now have a security token that's now passed back and they've authenticated. So now we can call the load user claims and the set JWT token. So the load user claims, this is again hard-coded for now. You'd want to get these from a data store. But all I'm doing is checking the username from our app security token that I passed to this method. And if it's Paul S., I set one set of claims. So I add on to the claims property of our security token class, and I create a new app user claim, passing in the user ID, setting up the claim type and the claim value. So I've got a claim type of get products. The next one, I have a claim type of get a product. The next claim for Paul S. is for search. Then if it's John K. who's logged in, he also gets claims. One is get a product. He didn't get products, he just has get a product. And then he has an add product and he has an update product. So he has different claims. One's in common, but then he has other different claims than what I have. So there is our adding user claims. Now, the next thing we do is we set the JWT token. So we pass in our settings, we pass in our app security token. Both of these are now fully loaded with all the information. The first thing we do is we build our JWT claims. So we're calling this JWT claims, passing in the app security token. All this does is it creates our standard JWT claims. So I've got a list of claims here. I'm going to create a new claim called JWT registered claim names.sub. That's the username. It's called the subject. Now this claim actually comes from the JWT package that I loaded in here. Okay, this is not the claims from my claim. It's not my app user claim. It's actually a claim object from system.security.claims. And then we're using these names like subject and JTI, the token identifier. So I'm just creating a new GUID. I'm adding the isAuthenticated claim here, right? I'm taking it right from the token saying, yep, the user was authenticated. Then I iterate over my claims for that one user, and I add it to the JWT claims using this claim class here. So now I've taken my claims that were personalized for me or for this John person, and I make them into real claims that can be sent out across the wire that JWT understands. After I have that JWT claims built, I now am going to create what's called a security token descriptor. Inside of here, I set the expire, so that's coming from that minutes to expiration we had. We have the issuer, we have the audience, we have our signing credentials, which is that key again. Okay, and I'm using this HMAC SHA 512 signature, and I'm adding those claims to the subject. We then create a token handler by creating a new instance of a JWT security token handler, and then we use that token handler to write the token, passing in tokenhandler.createToken from our token descriptor that we created up there on line 125. That bearer token is now a string representation of the JWT token that's stored into the bearer token property of our app security token class. Okay, that is a lot of code there, but we need all of this in order to authenticate a user and build a JWT bearer token. And now it's time to create a security router class to generate that JSON Web Token for us. Right mouse click on the Router Classes folder and add a class. We'll call it Security Test Router. Now this is just like our other router classes that we've created. We inherit from the router base. We then have a private read-only field, AdventureWorks API defaults. You can see on the constructor, we're passing both the iLogger in and the settings. And in the constructor, then I'm setting the settings. In the add routes override method, what I'm doing inside of here is I'm going to create my app.mapGet. So that URL fragment /authenticate user /name, that's a parameter we're going to pass in, /password, and then the parameter we're passing in. Those two then obviously get mapped into our function, which we then pass to this authenticate user function. The authenticate user, this is where we now use our new security manager here, and we call the authenticate user method, passing the name and the password and our settings.jwt settings property. And then whatever comes back is what we're going to now display on the screen. If we're authenticated, we will display that app security token. That's going to be our return value from this web API call. All right, we need to register this new security test router. So we go to our service extensions. We find our add router classes method, and we add our new router base now. Let's go ahead and run this. And what we should have now is a security test. And if I try this out, I can type in Paul S. And I can type in password. And when I execute this, if I've done everything correctly, I should have something that looks like this. This is my response body. You see the user information, you see the bearer token, you see my claims. All of this is exactly what I'm looking for to come back. This is the serialization of that app security token class. What's most important here is that bearer token. But take a look. I've got claims, get products, get a product search. Let's go ahead and go up here. Let's try this out again, but this time let's put in John K. And we'll execute him. Not literally, we'll just execute the method. Now, if you notice that he's got different claims, get a product, add product, update product, his bearer token looks completely different. But at least now we know that we have this authentication scheme set up. We have a JWT bearer token being created. We are almost ready to really rock and roll here. One of the things I mentioned in a slide earlier is that we can decode the contents of that JWT bearer token at JWT IO. Let's take a look at how to do that now. So this is the bearer token for John K. Let's go ahead and just copy that piece. Let's go over to JWT.io. And if we scroll down a ways, it says, hey, put your encoded data here, and it will decode it for us and show us what the header algorithm was. It'll show us what the payload data is and the signature. Now again, this is just encoding and decoding. This is not encryption and decryption. If you wanted to decrypt it, you can see right down here it says your 256-bit secret. Okay, you'd have to put that there, and then you'd be able to see how this was base 64 encoded. But the user of this is not going to have that, which means they can't add anything into this because it would invalidate that coding when it comes back. Even if this changes by a single letter, if this encoding changes by a single letter, it's going to reject it as a bad token. So now that we have the token, we've authenticated the user, how do we make this work with our endpoint where you're using the require authorization? Remember we added that .require authorization to the product route. Well, we can do that in Swagger by just adding JWT support. Swagger has that built in. Or we could actually go over to Postman, and in the headers we could actually add the bearer token and put that in there, and then we could call it from there. But I want to show you how to do it using Swagger so you don't need to use any other tools. Open the Service Extensions class and let's add another extension method here. Okay, so this one is called Configure Open API, and it's on that services collection. Now I'm taking those lines of code from program.cs that do the configuring of the Open API. So services.add endpoints API Explorer. And then there was the services.add Swagger Gen, but now what I'm doing is passing in some options. And these options are what's going to help us work with the Open API, the bearer token, for passing that bearer token to our product API or whichever API we're trying to call that has been secured. Now, it's not important that you understand everything that's going on in here. This code is just boilerplate. You're going to just put it in to this method just like it is. Once that's in there, now all we have to do is call this in the program.cs. Let me grab some code here. Let's open up program.cs. Let's scroll down, find these two lines of code here that we're doing the Open API configuration. And let's now call that method that we wrote that has all that code. And now let's run this. Now look what's happened over here on the right. We now have a little lock symbol. And we even have one right up here at the top right. It says authorize. So that's what we need to do now. We need to go out, run our security test. We'll put in Paul S. And we'll execute this. We now have my bearer token. We're going to copy that to the clipboard. And then we're going to come up, and I can do it here, or I can do it on the individual one that I want to test. That's fine. And I'm going to put in that bearer token because that's what it's asking me for. I then click on the Authorize button here. We can now close this. If I now try this out, remember before when I did this, it didn't work. Look at that. It's now working because the bearer token says, hey, you're authorized to make this call. And there's all the data. So we've got the security piece now working in ASP.NET Minimal API. All I've done is require authorization. So had I even used John K there, it still would have allowed me to run that product API. What we're going to do now is make sure that only I can run that product API and not John K. And we do that by adding claims to the token and securing that endpoint using the claims. If you remember, I had the claim for getting all products, but John K. did not. Locate the method configure JWT authorization inside of our service extensions class. It's inside of here that we're going to now add some more code. And the code here is what's going to be called policies. We're going to now add some policies. We're going to add a get products claim, get a product claim, search claim, add product claim, update product claim. And what happens is that we're saying that for each one of these policies, you're going to require a certain claim to be present in that bearer token. So we can take a look at each one of these, right? So I've got a get products where you see the policy.require claim, get products, get a product, search, add product, update product. So for each route, you could secure it based on some sort of claim. I'm going to use that get products claim. So open up the product router class again, locate where you had that require authorization. Okay, you see that. And now what I'm going to do is add one more thing in here, get products claim. Okay, now that then matches up with this policy right here. And if we were to go over to the security manager and we would scroll down and look for Paul S, you'll see that this get products claim, right, is what I have. Okay, so the product router, I'm saying get products claim, that maps then to this guy right here, right? So if we do this, we should now be able to run the code. Let's go log in. We'll do me. We'll execute. We'll get the bearer token. We will authorize. And we will now attempt to run get all products. It looks like it's going to do it, right? So we get back all of those products. Now, if we come back up here, click on the authorize button again and say log out and close this. If we were to execute again here, you can see now that we're getting this internal server error. So now let's go back down and let's try out John K and execute and get his bearer token. And we'll authorize him. Close this. Come back down and try to execute this again. And look at that. Boom. Right away, we got that problem where it says, an error occurred while processing your request. So at this point, what you'd want to do is actually add a little more error handling. And let's take a look at that in our next segment. Well, let's put in those codes to handle those authentication and authorization status codes. So we're going to handle a 401 and a 403. Open up the error router class, and you remember the status code that we wrote where we were checking for a 404 and then we returned a problem. Well, we're going to kind of rewrite this a little bit now. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually set up an iResult as a return value, because what we're going to do is we're going to add now a couple new case statements, a 401 and a 403. And here's the thing. When I have a 401 or a 403, I have a message. The problem is I really can't return that message because the results.challenge that you see here on line 39, it won't let you return a message. See, if we try to put it in here, not going to allow it. So what we really want to do is just simply return the challenge or the forbid, because that's the real number that somebody is expecting to get back. They're calling your API and they're not authenticated or they're not authorized. They need to know that number. If I did it the other way, where I was always returning problem, it would always return a 500. They're going to think something's wrong with our server. So we're just going to refactor this a little bit where we're now returning these. Let's go ahead and run this. And what we'll do now is let's try to run this first without doing anything. And we should now get back a real 401 error unauthorized. And that's, like I said, what we're looking for. We don't want to return a 500 and say it's not authorized, because they may not be looking at the message. They might be just looking for the actual error number coming back. If we now were to go down here to the security test and we were to log in with John K and a password, let's grab his bearer token. Let's go to the top here and authorize him. And let's try re-executing this now. We'll get a 403 error forbidden. So again, it doesn't really give us a good error message per se, but the number itself should be everything that the caller needs to know about why his call failed. In this lesson, we added JWT packages to our Web API project. We created some security classes that helped us authenticate a user and generated a JWT bearer token. We then added claims and secured an endpoint, and we modified error handling to handle security errors. Coming up next, get data from a database using the Entity Framework.